I'm just going to tell you a bit about EduSports. So EduSports is a Ghana registered NGO, and we are also registered in the UK as well. And what we do is we connect and train and equip volunteers who we call catalysts, over 250 of them. And these volunteers are a mix of teachers, students, and community members, and they drive change in their communities through education. And they also create what we call them EduLeads and EcoSTEM clubs, but they're transformative literacy and STEM opportunities. And they do female empowerment sessions and environmental sustainability as well. So in our education spaces, which we call sports, in Ghana and in Kenya, we have about 50 of them. Our volunteers lead sessions in STEM, in literacy, female empowerment, and environmental sustainability. And they do this in lead weekly sessions in this sports. And we have over 15,000 children who have come in through these sports. These sports are in underserved areas in Ghana and in Kenya. So what we are here for is what we call our Ignite Talks. And our Ignite Talks are sessions or webinars that we hold, and we bring in experts to come in to speak to these are volunteers or catalysts. And they're free sessions where we speak to a catalyst about important topics that we think will help our catalysts lead change in their communities. These sessions are run on Zoom, and they take place monthly. So why Cormac Russell, and why do we think he's a good fit to give this talk that we have today? So Cormac works with local communities, NGOs, and governments on asset-based community development and other strength-based approaches. His book, which is going to be like the central focus of this discussion, is called The Connected Community. And what the book does is it explores how to uncover hidden talents, assets, and abilities in our neighborhoods. And that's like EduSports' central ethos, where because we connect communities and we train volunteers and equip them to lead change in their communities. So we think that Cormac is the best fit to have this conversation with, and that's why Cormac is here today. So I'll hand over to Fad to do an introduction and tell us about Cormac's bio and Cat's bio. Cat will be interviewing Cormac.
Great. So it's a delight to introduce these two amazing personalities. And to start with, Cormac has been fascinated by how people and places weave together to find common purpose over 3 decades. In the early 1990s, Cormac began working with the Irish Health Board, professionally trained in therapeutic approach and psychological models. He worked with the children and youth and young people who were ward of court, attempting to support them into community care setting in neighborhoods as far away from formal institutions as possible. It was here that he learned the limits of institutional interventions, especially well-intended ones. It became painfully clear to him that taking young people who had experienced profound disruption and trauma and placing them in a new house in a strange neighborhood with others who had similar stories was not a genuine expression of community care. This work triggered a question that haunted him for many years and still drives him to this day. How many others are the edge of our communities, living in our neighborhoods, but are apart from us in every other sense? This question has come to define Cormac and his work. It was on the back of this question that he discovered John McKnight. Cormac and John's connection blossomed into a deep friendship and working collaboration that had spanned more than 2 decades. In 1996, Cormac established Nurture Development, a social enterprise dedicated to discovering meaningful ways to build communities from inside out, with a real welcome for the stranger at the edge. Since then, his work was contributed to the emergence of more community-centered approach in 4 continents. In 2015, he published Asset-Based Community Development, looking back to look forward, which provides an insight into the intellectual heritage of ABCD and traces the people who had the most influence on John McKnight's thinking In 2020, Cormac published his second book, Rekindling Democracy, a professional guide to working in citizen space, in which he sets out his vision for deeper local democracy and argues that the way to get there is to realize that neighborhoods are the most important units of change. And moving on to Cat's bio, Cat has been a classroom teacher for 12 years, teaching philosophy, ethics, critical thinking, with a particular interest in active citizenship education. She was selected as a Global Teachers Prize finalist in 2021 and is the founder and CEO of EduSport. She is passionate about both the role communities can play in transforming educational opportunities and the importance of critically reflective, active citizenship education. Her own understanding of education has been transformed through working with teachers and volunteers across EduSports network and beyond. Ladies and gentlemen, these are amazing personalities who are going to take us through this session. Thank you. Over to you, Kat, if you're ready.
Thanks, Fad. And I should mention that Fad is our Ignite program coordinator and is one of our volunteers from Saka Saka as well. So a key part of EduSpot's work is that so many of our staff team actually come from our volunteer network in different ways. So just to say a huge welcome, Cormac, from me, and also a huge welcome to everyone who's spent their evening joining us for this exciting session tonight. So first of all, keen to say that we really want this to be interactive. In EduSpots, I think it's fair to say that collaboration is the heart of everything we do. So if you have a question at any point, please don't wait to be asked for that awkward pause in the session. Just drop your questions into the chat as we go. If you want to speak out your question as well, do put your hand up, but also drop the question into the chat just so I can get a bit of a sense of what direction you're going to take our conversation in. So Cormac, welcome. A huge welcome to you.
Thank you, Kath. Good to be with you all.
Great. So I'm going to dive straight into the kind of core parts of your thinking. So I think I'm right in saying that the heart of all your work is this core message that really resonates with what we do at EduSpots. And this message is that local communities are full and abundant with all kinds of treasures, and that therefore in our approach, we should always look for what's strong in communities rather than what is wrong, and move away from delivering services towards this process of discovering assets. So I wonder, especially for people who might be new for your ideas, if you could just explain a little bit more about this core message and philosophy for those who might not already be aware of it, and also maybe tell us a bit about why you believe this is so important.
Yeah, happy to. So sometimes it's helpful, I think, to understand what the idea of abundance sits alongside and sometimes even speaks in opposition to, or at least in contrast to. And I think if we think about the opposite of abundance, we'd be thinking about scarcity. So much of how we think about helping people and making change happen is through the lens of scarcity. It's through the half-empty part of the glass. And the story is that we are broken, we are deficient, we are weak, we are needy, and therefore the best way to receive help is to receive it from those who are not broken, who are not deficient, who are not needy. That creates two problems. One is nobody is wholly broken. And even the narrative suggests that we're into a mindset which is about fixing. A human condition, particularly when it collectivizes with other human conditions, and indeed in relationship with Mother Earth, can only really flourish within the assumption of wholeness, even if there's trauma, and there is often, that we're all the time assuming wholeness is the journey that everybody is on or is drawn towards. The question is, how can we support that journey forward? There are times when it gets stuck. There are times when barriers are in the way. We have to acknowledge those. But we're not going to lift communities up by putting them down. And so the abundant mindset is a mindset that says two simple words: enough already. And in a lot of ways, when you see the person in front of you and you say, that person is enough already, and my job is to come into solidarity with them because our liberation is combined. So I talk about this idea that when we do change to a person, in that instance, we're doing violence to them. But when we enable them to do change by themselves, we are joining them in a human journey, a shared journey, which is a journey of liberation. And whether we're paid or we stand in solidarity as neighbors, we should be mindful of how we come into relationship with people, because we can do great harm as well as good.
Great. So I think one thing I'm really keen to sort of know, building from that, is how can we change the kind of narratives that do exist in our world around helping? So I think something EduSpots is also particularly passionate about, linking to your whole idea of, this idea of people having change done to them, is that I think a lot of charities across the world are almost, I guess it's the sort of big charity narrative that exists, that we are helping people who are helpless in different ways. And I often find myself on applications for forms, even in 2023, we're always asked to start with a problem. There's always this sort of beginning of defining the deficits, and any solution has to move from that. I never see on any of the application forms someone saying, what are the strengths you're building from? So I'm just curious, before we sort of go into the practical suggestions at the volunteer level, how can we as an organization play a role in really propelling this narrative that we're so aligned with?
Yeah, it's a great question. And just to kind of ground it in everydayness, I think the question is one of, how can we be better hosts in the lives of the people we serve? So we're coming into their community. We're coming to their kitchen table. We're not trying to get them to come to our boardroom table. I think that's the first mindset shift, that what we're actually called to in service terms is better guesting rather than better hosting. So I'm not convinced that it's the art of hosting. I think it's the art of guesting. Hosting is important, of course, as well, but you wouldn't go into somebody's house and say, I've looked at your refrigerator and I've looked at your presses and I've had a look in your wardrobes. Here are all the things that I think are problematic about the way you organize your house. And by the way, what's for dinner? But that's precisely what a lot of charities do to communities. Mm-hmm. They're appalling guests. Not alone are they appalling guests, but actually, when they do identify what they think the problem is, they then keep the money that's available to address the problem, to pay their salaries and build their revenue. And they say, your problem is my service. In other words, your problem is you're missing the service that I provide. And this is fascinating to me, that, I've worked in Rwanda, I've worked in Nairobi, but also across Kenya. I've worked in South Sudan, South Africa. So this is a commentary, I guess, in that context, but it's a worldwide commentary, that nearly every agency starts its encounter with communities with a needs assessment. And many of those who have heard me speak before know what I'm about to say next. And that is that the only thing that needs analysis is needs analysis. It's a really problematic frame. So we've got brilliant practitioners working in charities, working in public sector organizations, who, if they have any level of experience working in communities, know that this isn't really a good way to start. But they're sort of hemmed in by the rules or the expectations of a donor or their organization. And so I think, to answer your question, one of the practical things we can do is to start saying we're not going to do needs assessment as a starting point in communities. We're actually going to start with asset inventories. We're going to start a different conversation. So instead of trying to be helpful, and always when people say we've come to help you, the next thing that follows is, tell us what is problematic about you, so that we can see if your problem matches our program. That's the first thing we have to interrupt. We have to disrupt that narrative. And I think we have to replace that with, tell us what's wrong within your community. What are your priorities here? What is it you want to work on? And then tell us how we can be useful to your work. So the minute we say, how can I help you? I think we create a one-up, one-down relationship. When we say, how can I be useful to you? I think we create a servant relationship. But it becomes much more powerful when we start with, let's be curious instead of helpful. And let's discover and help you to discover what you have. What are your resources, your competencies, your building blocks to go towards equity, to go towards prosperity, to go towards climate response change, whatever it might be, whatever the priorities in that community may be. So that's the very first thing we need to do. So the shorthand here is shift from what's wrong to what's strong, and don't be helpful, be curious.
Really, really interesting. So I thought I'd share a little bit more about how EduSpots work and our model. We'd love to get your input into it. So I think the overall vision of EduSpots is that we want to create a world where communities unite to create the futures that they want to see. So I think right in the heart of our model is this idea of self-determination by communities, by groups of individuals. So people often ask us, how do we find these teams of people that run the spots? So what we do currently now is we ask people to apply. We ask groups of committed individuals who are from and based in a community to apply to us, understanding our model. And then they go through an interview process where I guess as well, we need to focus more on getting them to explain more about what their vision for the future is and what different skills and talents they bring. I think that's already part of our process. And then it's actually the local team, once accepted, who then build a wider membership in their community, that they then go on to build a sort of wider volunteer team. And then EduSpots offers flexible grant funding that is decided by the community members themselves. One of the problems I think that our community members and volunteers, I think speaking on their behalf, would often say that they have, is that it can be quite difficult to sometimes get people involved in the project. And I know in your book, you speak a lot about how to kind of understand the skills and motivations of people. I wonder if you have any practical advice for our local volunteers on how to build their teams.
Well, first of all, thank you to everybody who is doing the work of building a community from the inside out. There's no right or wrong model. All models are useful at some level. What I think is really powerful is that level of commitment and finding a way of bringing people into a sense of membership around moving in that direction is powerful. So just to honor your work and say, it's a real privilege to be in solidarity with you in this conversation. So I certainly will not be, making any comment on your work except positive, because I think when we think about that very local question of how can I broaden my circle of participation, I want to do something to make my community a little bit more vibrant, a little bit more inclusive, a little bit more just. How do I get more people to come along on that journey with me? I think that's such a universal question. I hear that so often. So just staying with that question for a moment, I think communities by their nature are places where you've got people who come together consensually by choice and bring their passions, bring their priorities, and try to find a way of connecting those and mobilizing them into action. But the difficulty, I think, is that so often, somebody starts with a passion, with a project, something they really care about. And I think because that's where they've started, the call to engagement is come join my project. And I think that is both a great starting point and also a real dilemma, because not everybody is going to respond to that call. So it's a bit like, a duck hunter who goes out and blows a duck whistle, but they're in a place where that particular species of duck don't respond to that whistle. So part of growing community is to not just blow the duck whistle, which says, come and help me with my project. Come share my passion. Because the only species of duck you're going to get are those that share your passion. It's a bit like saying, come join my consultation or come join a meeting. You'll get people who are attracted, or come volunteer. Even the word volunteer is not a universally attractive word. So part of the challenge in building a connected community is that we don't build it around projects, but we build it around culture. So the unit of change is not the project. The unit of change is not even the issue. The unit of change is certainly not the individual, because you can't build a community around an individual for very long. It can happen, get inspiring. Donald Trump seems to be doing it at the moment, but how long that community lasts and how productive it is over time is a question, and I think a very strong question, for which I have a lot of reservations. So I think one of the other ways of doing this is to say, you do your project. It's important that we express our passion and we live into our passion, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there's a little bit of discretionary energy. Say you give 80% of your time to your project, you might be able to shave off 20%. And you say, you know what I'm going to do? Because I'm a neighbor, so my project is a neighbor to a wider community of people who may never be interested in my project, but they are interested in our common shared vicinity, perhaps, like the place where this project is going to play out. Or they're interested in the people that, are common to our project and to their issues. So I think, for example, in the Kasaba district, with the Wellspring Foundation in Rwanda, what they began to learn using ABCD, and we did some coaching with them, was if you go into schools, right, and you begin to have a conversation with the parents about what their priorities are in their village, you get a huge amount of ideas. But if you start by training the parents to do an acid map and find connectors in the village, and then you talk with those connectors, you get a much deeper understanding at village level for what all the priorities are. So if you could do that with 20% of your energy, right, as well as doing your project, imagine what these edu spots could then do. Because what you would then be able to do is you would say, so do your project, but you're also a community builder, and you're going to create the environment within which the next generation of edu spots are going to emerge. So I think in simple terms, what I'm talking about is making the village the unit of change, not just the project or not just the issue. I have nothing against the project or the issue. We need those too, so I don't want to minimize them. But what I'm trying to add here is what E.F. Schumacher might call the middle way, right? The Buddhist economics. So there is a middle way here, and I think place, particularly in the global south, offers so much, because Mother Earth and where we're rooted in indigenous ways of knowing is incredibly important. So being on country, being on land, it's a very, very powerful way to move, I think.
Wow, there are so many follow-up questions I could ask to that. I'm curious just to go down on a sort of educational line in terms of school-based notions of citizenship, just because I think you just touched upon this subject. I've often felt that I think sometimes when we promote notions of volunteerism or service, I think you recently posted something of this kind on Twitter, that we can sometimes miss the kind of everyday activities that we have in a community context that contribute to community. And I know currently with all the challenges that we might have in the world related to climate or other concerns that we have, where we're beginning to increasingly realize that all of our everyday actions are important, not just the acts we do as a volunteer. I'm curious to know, in terms of education in schools, just to switch the narrative a little, how do you think we can in our schools bring up this idea of everyday active citizenship and community connectedness in our education systems?
I think it has an awful lot to do with humility. So one of the most powerful things an institution, particularly a local institution like a school, can do in the first instance is begin to really think of itself, the institution, as something more than just about its core mission. So I think it's a great missed opportunity for a school to just think it's about education, or maybe let me reframe it, for the school to think it is the site of education, that the classroom is where people learn. Because I think the minute you start entertaining that notion, you miss the key insight to where wisdom and learning actually happens, which is in the community. So this is why I think we can see situations where schools, for example, often in the global south that have been built by the hands of community, then become silos and little fortresses that the community send their children to receive a kind of a banking model, as Paulo Freire would, describe it. So it's this idea of you send your deficient children to the expert, who then banks them full of knowledge and then sends them out as cannon fodder for the marketplace. That's a very Western, colonial, white man notion of education. I think that has to be challenged very fundamentally. And that's part of active citizenship. So the school, I think, would be far more powerful a model of active citizenship, not by teaching active citizenship on the curriculum, but by recognizing that one of the most powerful things they can do is enable the children in their classrooms to connect to the wisdom in the neighborhoods and the villages and the citizens around them, and to actually enable them. So, for example, we have a very deep relationship in Bumlo, which is an island off the Bergen coast, where from the very beginning of education, so in kindergarten, children learn ABCD, which is to say, in practical terms, the conversation starts with, what are your gifts? What are your strengths that you can contribute to the well-being of your community? And the school becomes an enabler of that conversation. And this is a really important piece as well, of course. A gift is not a gift until it's given. So the child has to be able to contribute that gift. But a gift is not a gift until it's received either. So the community have to be able to receive the gift and then share their own gifts. So I think, schools should not be shut 6 months of the year. We should be, as we have seen in Rwanda, as we've seen in some of the work we've done in the Rift Valley in Kenya, we should be seeing schools as economic hubs, places where people can access affordable produce at the weekend. We should be seeing community gardens so that children aren't walking for hours to school, not able to get food. In so many ways, that would be, to my mind, instead of talking about active citizenship, that would be living active citizenship. So for those who are listening, who are principals or are educationalists at the global level, I would say to you, there's a little bit of a challenge to put your money where your mouth is, and to recognize that your institutions are an asset for community building. You're a guest in those communities, and your facilities should be open at night for adult education. Your grounds are actually community grounds. You would not exist but for the community, and you are a neighbor in that community. And so we need to move out of our silos, because silos are where smart people go to do dumb things. It's a bit like having libraries that only lend books. Those days are gone. We need to grow up, show up, and share. And that's community too. So it's not about curriculum. It's about how you actually behave.
Wow. So yeah, so much here that just ties into different aspects of EduSpot's work. So actually our history, I think, stems from the first library project we were involved in, where it was very much within a private school, where the resources were not being widely shared, where there was little sense of community ownership. And so the very sort of building blocks of EduSpots were upon this idea of connecting schools to communities, and also making sure that no school works alone in a silo of any form, and that we could bring different schools together, different teachers together, and different students together, rather than having this kind of asset hoarding that is often a major sort of problem. And just to kind of explain that, I guess, the core model of our centers that we call spots. So in case you weren't aware, in Ghana, spots are sociable or drinking spaces, that there are all these sort of spots that are all over Ghana with different diverse names. And I think what we were trying to do from the start with EduSpots is have this idea that the spots were these flexible centers where, as you've said, they're not sort of quiet spaces where they're just reading books, but rather they're spaces, I think in your book, you described them as skills libraries where people can contribute the different skills they have to offer. And very much, again, not, I think in Ghana, often you have the idea as education being in the formal school context, but we're looking at education more widely, whether, you know, that's local storytelling or, you know, farming abilities. That's the kind of model we're building towards. But sometimes it can be quite hard, actually, when people have a particular concept of education or even the educated. So sometimes there's a sense in our communities that only certain people can be volunteers or associated with the spots that have a certain level of education. So just looking for any suggestions from you and how we can truly make these centres and these spaces more inclusive and really bring in this wider community spirit. I know you covered that a bit in your first sort of point, but just to develop that a little further.
Yeah, I think again, it's interesting to think about education, health, security. We talk in the book about, you know, 7 different functions, and many of those functions have been brought out of indigenous ways of knowing and collective. So I mean, we could talk about education, but actually an indigenous way of talking about education is wisdom. So, you know, where might I go to have a conversation about wisdom, about indigenous ways of knowing? What are some of the rituals that in Ghana historically would have cultivated a way that people could show up? So storytelling, orality versus literacy. I would say, for example, if you really want to stimulate that sort of way of talking about wisdom, of really decolonizing the conversation, it's very important to mind our language and to really intentionally use the language of the poet and not the economist. So beginning to, you know, and we see this with our indigenous brothers and sisters, and they in community ways of knowing with respect to, you know, the work we're doing in Canada and in the US, and indeed even the Sami community in Norway, and of course the Irish traveling community in Ireland and the UK. And one of the things that's really clear is when we say to folks who feel alienated by formal systems, like, you know, classroom-based ways of learning or clinic-based ways of doing education, and often see this, you know, Black and brown communities in the US, for example, and in the UK, that feel there's structural racism and that they really will not engage. So we saw this with COVID. It wasn't that people were necessarily anti-vax, but there wasn't sufficient trust in the communities to really engage with the institutions. So I think there's a lot of stuff to unpack when you say, come to a classroom environment and let's have a conversation about education. Is that really what we're inviting people into? Or are we asking them to come together to talk about ways of knowing that respect their heritage, respect their traditions, respect their cultures, and recognize in a lot of ways that those ways of knowing and those rituals, you know, which could sometimes, I know in the work that we've done in Kenya and in Rwanda, you know, when we actually went back into understanding the historical ways that communities would problem solve and would, you know, kind of talk about issues, a lot of it was around storytelling, actually, and sharing, and it could go on for 3 days. But also the whole process of how you create forums so that the body politic can create a democratic way. You were talking about active citizenship earlier, a democratic way of being inclusive of all voices, of all genders, of all abilities, is really critical too. So I'm not at all particularly like when I think about, you know, post-genocide in Rwanda, I'm not always convinced that schools are the best gathering places in all instances. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're neutral spaces. But I think we have to be very reflective. They're not always. There's power attached to the clinic, to the classroom, you know, to the courthouse and so on. And I would be very cautious about making that the site of a first conversation. Try and push it much more towards the kitchen table, or, you know, whatever the equivalent might be. push it much more towards the community. Over time, if you're asked as an institution to provide a site for hosting, then go, but I wouldn't start there. In the UK context, they have, as you know, Kat, they have an initiative around social prescribing, and it's a really good intention to try to kind of help people get back into community life and social ways of being in the world. But I think the best of those people are actually out on the streets in the community, building relationships at that level.
Yeah, really interesting. So EduSpots has had quite a few discussions over the years about the role that spaces play in our education programs. And some of our spots are based in schools, and we kind of call them school-based spots, and others are in community spaces. And there have even been some people who've run quite successful programs in a shop, as our team in Elmina have done for quite a while, or under a tree. And we've come to realize, I guess, that space is important, that there often is a physical space with which, you know, people associate that act of coming together to explore education of any form. But it's been interesting that often the more sort of clubs have sometimes been easier to handle in the kind of way that I guess is more formal within a school setting. So I'm just interested, if we are developing this model of community-led education that connects with schools but is sort of separate in a sense, does the space matter? And what do you think are the benefits of being in a school as opposed to being in a community?
Again, I think, you know, depending on how radical you want to be, that's a conversation to be had locally, you know, and the way to test it is who shows up and who doesn't, you know. So I think it might be about not having any one entry point to the conversation. So the issue might not necessarily be that, you know, we're trying to figure out where's the most optimal location, but perhaps recognizing that diverse bumping places and gathering spaces exist in every community, one of which could be a school. I don't know. I know, for example, there's some schools that are very welcoming and some schools you wouldn't go near. You just wouldn't feel welcome. You'd feel quite the opposite. So some of it's about the space, but it's also could be about the governance, about the culture. There could be a wonderfully welcoming principal, you know, in one place, not in another. So I think it's the people who are curating and convening that space who shape the nature of that space. For me personally, the EduSpots may just want to be curious about where are the multiple places of welcome, places of belonging, places of hospitality, and being open to being surprised, you know. So it might be that when you discover a particular place where people say, when I come here, I feel psychologically well and safe and welcomed. And, you know, whatever it is we're doing here as a community, as a group, I know on the days I don't show up, I'll be missed. That's magic. That isn't just about the place. Place can help that, but it's also about the group life of the people who gather in that place. So I know from the work that we've done in the Rift Valley in Kenya, where, you know, the farmer field schools gathered under trees. They didn't have, you know, they had, I suppose, a space in the sense, open air, but it was the way that they invested in each other, in the group life, that it then enabled them to begin to start forming networks across these farmer field schools, building their Vicobas, you know, their village banks, but also then between the Pokot and Turkana tribes, where there was a huge amount of conflict, it was possible for those associations of farmer field schools to be able to broker peace agreements, right? So, you know, and therefore new spaces start to, you know, get negotiated. And I think that's the point also for us to be really aware of. You know, when we talk about EduSpots, what are we talking about? Are we just talking about people being educated so they can leave the villages to go to, you know, urban environments to work? Or are we talking about something that's much more fundamentally about how do we live lightly on the planet? How do we educate people to move in a way through their lives which mean their lives are flourishing, which mean that we're promoting cooperativism rather than competition, that actually enculturate people into ways of knowing? And I would just really put as somebody who's too pale, too male, and too stale to have any real opinion on the matter. I would nevertheless humbly submit that I personally have so much to learn from Indigenous ways of knowing, and so much to unlearn as somebody who would be a poster child for education, right? So like, you know, in that sense, in terms of credentialism and all of that stuff, I think what I have had to do is to unlearn an awful lot of that stuff in order to really learn ways of being in the world, which I think are going to be so critical moving forward. EduSpots also may, I think, have to create spaces where people might be politically challenging, maybe even bite the hand that feeds in terms of donor funding. So it may be a space for political contestation, asking the Gates Foundation critical questions about the way it currently is dispersing funding, and it thinks about change, asking the World Bank why it's emphasizing electrification while at the same time promoting the hydrodamming of communities and driving young people out of urban or rural farming and into subsistence ways of living in, you know, Kibera, for example, in Nairobi and places like that. These are, in my mind, what EduSpots should also be doing. So they, and the difficulty with this, if I may say, is that particular revolution won't be funded. There's no donor or government that's going to say, hey, we want to put money into this, right? Because, and I'm not preaching revolution here. What I'm talking about is a revolution of the heart. I think with education, the word edu, right, its original, is to educe, to bring forth from the person the light of the gift that they have, that if they contribute it to the community, will make the community and the environment sustainable. That's what educe means, the original word of educate. It's not about credentialism.
Okay, just to, there's so many, again, different strands I'd love to pick up on there. And just to say, please do throw your questions into the chat. I'm going to go to some of them in a minute. But I think there were just some things within what you said that were so important to just emphasize. So I think your point at the start where you sort of said, actually, maybe it's a faulty question, which space is best in the school and the community, is one of those questions where we have to turn to the community and see what works best for them, or look at this sort of emerging organic sort of features and relationships within a community. And I think I often find that we get trapped in social entrepreneurship into this I don't know, this model where we're forced to say, what is your model that you're going to scale? I even get asked, okay, tell us what your spot looks like. How many meters square is it? What kind of shape is it? And I just say, I do fight back and I say, these are the wrong questions. The questions to be asked is, what is your philosophy? Who's making the decision? Who has the power? What is the sort of model of education? That actually the physical makeup, where it is, and all these things, the key question is, yeah, it's not what is the sort of uniform space, but rather what is our way of working where the community are taking leadership in different ways. I think secondly, your point about there being this difference in philosophies of education at the heart of our work, and that I think I love observing sort of different ways of seeing education. And I think in Ghana, education is just such an important tool for making money and gaining employment. And many people see education primarily through, I hope that the volunteers and the Ghanaians in this room would agree that quite often education is presented as the key tool for gaining more income for the family, to have a more healthy life in different ways. And that sometimes, again, with my very Western eyes on this, we want to create an education that is more built from community learnings, Indigenous knowledge, that sense of self-determination. But sometimes that in itself can feel like a privilege in different ways. And it's difficult for sometimes for me to explain at the community level, or feel that that's my position to say that actually we should have this other idea of education that is more about preserving local knowledge and custom, when the reality is often they just need that money to fund their futures in different ways. I'm going to, just because I think we could carry along that line in a longer sense, I'm going to dip into the chat where there's some great questions. I think the question from Helen, I think is an important one. We talk a lot about community self-determination coming from the grassroots. But I think we're all aware that a lot of the systemic injustice in the world can come from outside the community or come from institutions. So I'm just so curious to know, how does the role of the community intersect when we're trying to create change? How do we work with communities, but also alongside broader institutions and broader centers of power?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. And there's a lot of different ways into this. So the Gandhian perspective, so Gandhi in responding to British colonization in India, was very clear. If you look at the Salt's reaction, or indeed even the metaphor of the spinning wheel, where you had a colonizer who was essentially extracting resources from communities, producing in cotton mills and again abusively doing so in poor communities in the UK, and then selling those textiles back again to the communities that it had extracted from. I mean, this is a story I think a lot of people in the global South, including Ghana, can relate to. I mean, that there's something about having some analysis. That's part of education, right? So what he was trying to do, I think, was to make people aware of that dynamic, and then to make informed choices. It's not that you shouldn't go and pursue self-interest or find a sustainable way of living, but also in the longer term, finding sustainable ways forward collectively. And it's in that spirit that land trusts emerged, right? In those very early days, Gandhi would have said, in terms of peaceful resistance, spend a half a day at your spinning wheel. So don't lose the self-reliant ability to do and produce what you can with what you have, because that gives you power. And it may not be enough power to change everything, but it is important power for what it is at the local level. And with that power and with that independence, we can organize collectively to begin other forms of resistance. And that philosophy, by the way, I mean, we all know the story, but I'm really struck by, after 10 or 15 years of organizing at that level. And remember, Gandhi organized in South Africa before he organized in India. And people forget that story. So it's like, well, what difference does that make? What difference does, that kind of level of organizing make? But then you recognize the history of that story and you think, 15 years after he began that process, one day in the offices of power in Delhi, there was this roaring, thunderous noise coming up through the offices. And I think the Minister of Justice talking to some other people said, well, what's going on outside? And they looked outside the window and there were thousands upon thousands of people shouting the name Gandhi, because it had kind of consolidated in the popular imagination through peaceful means, a way of, and it's still it's a work in progress, but a way of people beginning to collectivize around voice and around agency. The problem, I think, is that so many academics particularly pit the idea of mutual aid, self-reliance, against the idea of institutional reform, as if these two things are just two different tools that have to go in opposite directions, when in fact, they can actually be mutually reinforcing of each other, particularly if you're serious, and this is a core issue. If you're serious about trying to really build widespread solidarity, for social change. So it isn't just an elite number of people who feel very passionately, say, about climate change, who are pushing the agenda. Because, like, for example, in the Netherlands, this is a kind of an interesting case in point. In the Netherlands, the Netherlands government actually are very supportive around climate response and climate change. And they pushed really, really heavily. So the policy wind was very much behind the environmental movement. And anybody, I'm sure you've all been watching the news the same way as I do. I work very closely there. But what that kind of happened to create is exactly what's created everywhere in the world. You have knock-on effects, which create polarization. So the farmers' movement started to react against that. And now we see is the collapse of a government supportive of environmental issues and the rise of, I don't want to make judgments, but the rise of the farmers movement. They've got some really good issues and they've got some right-wing issues. But you have now what seemed like an incredible movement towards reform has actually swung back in a quite complex way. So I think that's a lesson for us in the management of public narrative, and trying to figure out ways that we can bring people along, even people who disagree with us, along on the journey. The big challenge we have, Kath, it feels to me, is we have a world with so many single-track politics issues being advanced. And where I feel we need to get to is finding a way that these single-track politics can actually start talking to each other and move into solidarity with each other, even across very significant fault lines. Now, if that isn't what education should be about, I don't know what is. The ability to listen to somebody who has a fundamentally different opinion to you, to suspend your own judgment, and to actually learn something new from another perspective. So that feels really important to me. So that question around how do we actually do that? Our work at grassroots level is supporting small local community groups just to learn how to actually participate in the lives of the community. I'll just say this very briefly. That begins to build confidence. It isn't just about mutual aid and doing nice things locally. It also enables them to say, here are the things we can do ourselves locally. We can spend half an hour at the spinning wheel, but that's not going to change education policy across India or across wherever a person's asking the question, Ghana or the UK or wherever it might be. I see we have people calling in today from the Netherlands as well. So it's not going to answer those questions, but what it does answer is this question. How do we make sure when we do come to talk about policy change that we have the broadest base of participation possible and that there's diversity of viewpoints? And I think the way to do that is to move into a much more localized participatory model of democracy. And I accept that representative democracy has its place, but I think the way to do that is very, very local. It's in neighborhoods, it's in villages, it's in hyper-local places. So that's probably a bit of a long-winded answer, but these are complex questions.
Yeah, and I think one of the best things we can do in education and in organizations is ensuring that participation is part of our models and in different ways in the classroom. I think in EduSpots, in all the different strands of clubs we run, whether it's literacy, eco-STEM, Ignite Girls, that we try to make sure that students know that they can take a leadership role, that they can play a role in decisions. And it's the way EduSpots is run as an organization and movement more widely, that we want to make everyone feel like they have a voice in the decision that change is made. But that does take a lot of work to get people, I think, into that mindset, as I think our society in different parts of the world is still built in a way where we're expected, as I think John Alexander, you might have come across his ideas of this idea that we're still stuck in this kind of consumer mindset. We've moved maybe from the subject mindset where we're told to do things. Now we're sort of in this mindset where we're expected to receive things from different people or buy different products. I'm aware of time, and I've got an important question from Edward, who's from Dodoma Yawiazu, one of our volunteers there. I think earlier you said that volunteer is perhaps not the best word to maybe describe the role of what we actually call them catalysts in our community, is the type of word we've gone for. Just really interested to know if you might have another word that you might use for the word volunteer that might be better reflecting the kind of role that they're taking in EduSpots.
Let me see if I can answer this with a wider kind of principled view. So I think when we choose words, it's useful to try to understand what it is we're trying to achieve. Are we trying to define the relationship of the person in terms of how they relate to an institution? So, I mean, I talk about this similar to what John is talking about in Citizens. I talk about it in Rekindling Democracy as well. It's the same point. It's exactly the same point. That if we're using language to define somebody by their relationship to our service, that's a problem. And sometimes a volunteer is somebody who's volunteering for a service. So they become like an extension of the service. They jump through the hoops of the service, and their allegiance is to the service, right? And maybe to the other volunteers. But, what I'm really interested in, and I understand that the word volunteer can mean lots of other things. I'm not fundamentally against the word. I'm just simply saying if it's the only word you're using, then it can be limiting if what you're interested in is broadening your circle of participation. So there may be other words and other language you use, which actually defines the person by their relationship and allegiance to other folks like them. So you're not talking about service users. You're not talking about patients. You're not, even the word student. The word student defines the child or pupil by their relationship to the school. So what are the words that you would use that would define the child by their relationship to their family, to their community, to their environment, to their ritual, to their heritage, to their tradition? So I'm not saying volunteer. Volunteer is one word. Patient is a word. Pupil is a word. But what do those words symbolize? And is it possible that we can be more wordy? Because in every word, there is a world. And that we can bring the world of the community into the words that we use. So I would certainly, whatever about volunteer, I'm agnostic about volunteer because I think, most people know what we mean. But I would be very cautious about words like end user, service user, client. The word client comes from the Latin word incline, which means to be on your back and powerless and in need of a patron. My goodness, what an awful word. So when we use words, when we use language, I would say let's use language that doesn't define a person out of their community and into an institution, but let's use words that reveal the power of the community. That's all I'm saying. I'm not against volunteering per se.
Thanks. That's a great answer. And I think we've often found that words can take on their own meaning through how they're used within a particular community. And within EduSpots, I think we found that language can be actually a really uniting and connecting feature of our work in different ways.
Can I just add really one thing?
Of course.
One time, very briefly, one thing that you can find as well is to say, you have a tradition like volunteering on the first Saturday of every month. And then that can get co-opted by the government. And so the government says, we will volunteer every month in your community, but it becomes an obligation. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the features of volunteering is I consent and I choose with my neighbors or with fellow members to do this as a freely given gift of the heart. It isn't something I'm compelled to do. It is something I choose to do as a gift. Right? You cannot compel me to donate blood to you. That's a freely given gift. The minute the government says you have to donate blood, it is no longer volunteering. I'm no longer doing it voluntarily. Mm-hmm. Now, you know the country I'm talking about. So I don't want to get, I don't want to say any more about that. But so we need to understand these distinctions, that these language words we're using are also deeply political. Mm-hmm. And that's important from an educational perspective. Children should be learning those distinctions from a very early stage.
Definitely. Just getting Godwin, who's jumping in to say that participants maybe creates a sense of belonging. We currently use Catalyst for volunteer and Spark for student, as we wanted to, I think, inculcate the focus on the change rather than on the on the kind of relationship with something that you've mentioned. Do we have a moment?
Yeah.
I know we've reached 8 o'clock, but Fahd has got a question. Are you happy to go? Okay.
Sure.
So Fahd, I don't know if you want to speak your question actually, just to get some different voices in, put him on the spot.
Right. So in Cormac's book, he stated or outlined how communities can create Ubuntu by using the ABCD approach. Yes, I would want Cormac to please throw more light on the ABCD approach and then how that would help communities to create Ubuntu.
To create Ubuntu. Well, I suppose what I feel personally when I think about ABCD is I think of it not as a model, but as a description. And I think of it as a description of what people do when they're effective together. So I would say, rather than say, what can ABCD help communities do? I would say that what ABCD describes is what communities do, which the net result of which, or the manifestation of which, we might call Ubuntu, which is, you know, that value, that spirit that says, I am because we are. So it's the collective tradition. And so, you know, I could talk about the 12-step movement, the AA movement. I could talk about the breastfeeding movement. I could talk about the credit union movement, and so on and so on. You know, there are examples from all over the world of, you know, in the South African context, a much broader, we would call Ubuntu. So I think in the book, The Connected Community, what myself and John McKnight are trying to say is, first and foremost, anything that's in that book has been learned at the feet of citizens. It's not a theory and it's not a model. All models are wrong. Some are useful, right? So the minute you start trying to say, here's the way, you're in trouble. So this is not a paint by numbers. But what it is, it's certainly not a map in that sense, but what it is a compass. It gives people a shared set of descriptive possibilities. It's saying, here are the things we have learned from other neighbors, other citizens, in terms of how they are effective together. You might find some of these fetching. You might find actually some of these confirming, because you're doing some of them already. Now, as you read the book, or as you do, you know, have conversations, is there something in those stories that is helpful? So that's one dimension. The other thing that we try and do in the book, which kind of contradicts a little bit of what I've said, but we take the risk in good faith, is to say, is there something at a kind of an intentionality level or structure level that seems to be recurring across, like we've seen thousands and thousands over the last 30, 40, 50 years of communities that are powerful against the backdrop of some really difficult situations? Are there recurring patterns? And one of the recurring patterns that we see, there's lots in the book, I haven't time to go into them now, but one that's worth lifting up for those that are listening here is that people start by discovering what they have, first of all. Not because there aren't issues externally, but because to them, it seems sensible to begin to say, what is it that we have in our refrigerators, in our cupboards, in our pantries, in our, you know, stores that we can begin with? So what are our building blocks? So they begin with discovery, and then they proceed in the second phase to begin to kind of connect those assets. And then finally, and this is really important, they begin to use those new connections, those new relationships, to mobilize into action. So I'd mentioned earlier on the schools in Rwanda. Say, okay, it's 49 schools in the Gasabo district. They say, well, we have 400 villages that our pupils, right, are coming from. So when they're in those villages, they're not called pupils. They're maybe called citizens, or they're called members of the community. But what is it within those communities that's powerful and vibrant? And how, if we cooperated more with them, might we all be better off, the school and the villages, right? So how might we do? That's connecting. And then they sit down and they say, what is it we could do together that we can't do alone? So the village people say, hey, our kids are walking long distances to school, they're hungry. And so they grow bananas, they grow kale, you know, they don't have toilets. So they begin to dig trenches, you know, so all of those things. Now, does it solve the education system in Rwanda, the poor, you know, salary of teachers? No, there are other issues. But I guarantee you, if you've got 400 villages that have actually mobilized, not just voice to kind of talk about social reform, but actually feel a sense of civic muscle, when they do put pressure on government for reform, people sit up and listen, in a way that just simply marching or protesting, particularly in repressive regimes, is just not feasible. It's not a safe thing to do for a lot of people. But what is safe is to kind of begin to grow that groundswell and to be productive at that level. So the key thing, Fahd, I wish we had more time. I feel like I'm spending a lot of time answering questions. I apologize for not being more succinct. But the key thing here in the book is we're saying, don't let yourself be drawn into simply being a consumer, right? A consumer of services. We all consume services sometimes, but it's actually only a very small part of who we are. We're fundamentally producers, makers, creators. That's what I learned when I was at school. That's what I learned by joining my GAA club and playing hurling. That's what I learned through the different associations that I was part of growing up. Not just how to advocate for my consumer rights. I never walked around thinking I was a pupil or a patient or an end user. I was a neighbor. I was somebody, and I was surrounded by productive other bodies. And yeah, we had difficulties and we lived in poverty. You talked about the edu spot earlier on, Kath, as the drinking spot.
Mm-hmm.
And in rural Ireland, that spot was the well. That's where the community came together. And a well was always at the crossroads, because that's where everybody would kind of travel from different. We stand today, environmentally, socially, economically, and in terms of health and well-being, at a crossroads. And it's a crossroads that is a crossroads about democracy. Now, if we work on the basis that the solution to all of our great challenges will come by ensuring we have better hospitals, better schools, better judiciary, then we really miss a fundamental understanding of what democracy is all about. Because at the center of democracy is not an institution, though our institutions are hugely important. They supplement our lives. They don't replace them. And one of the difficulties I think I see in an awful lot of the industrialized countries is that we're not living in a democracy. We're living in a technocracy, where the role of the citizen is defined as that which happens after the important work of the professional is done. So our education is in the hands of a teacher. Our health is in the hands of a doctor. Our safety is in the hands of police officers. Now, I don't know if you notice things the way I do, but what I notice is that police officers deal with crime. They don't produce safety. What I notice is that doctors patch you up when you're sick. They don't produce health. And what I know, bless the even best of teachers, the really good ones will say the primary educators in the life of a child are their parents. Now, in each instance, what they're telling us is we have work to do. That actually community life is the great source of production, and that education is not produced by the teacher and consumed by the pupil, but it really does take a village. That's what the book's about. And I think once we understand that, then the question is, how do we actually do something about it? Everybody, Faid, I think you'd agree, will agree with the notion it takes a village to raise a child. But what does it take to raise a village? That's the question the book is asking.
Great. Thank you very much, Cormac.
Thank you so much, Cormac. So I know that we've come sadly towards the end of our time with you, and I just want to sort of spotlight on just some of the things you just ended on saying there. I think really stuck with me the phrase that we are fundamentally producers, makers, and creators. Be a neighbor, I think really shone through with me. And just for those of you who haven't read Cormac's book, I thought I'd just quickly share what the book looks like so that you can hopefully get a copy. And I'll be trying to bring some of these out to our spots in Ghana at some point. But I thought these 6 neighborly principles were quite important to finish on, as I know this is ultimately right at the heart of what you're trying to promote. So being a neighbor involves discovering one another and what surrounds you, welcome one another and the stranger, portray one another and your neighborhood in terms of gifts, share what you have to secure what your neighbor wants, celebrate one another's comings and goings, the plantings and harvests, envision with one another towards a preferred future. And I think this particularly resonated with us as our slogan that's kind of caught across EduSpots is our collective future, which is what we're all working to in different ways from different angles. So just want to say a huge thank you, Cormac, on behalf of the whole EduSpots and everyone here for your time. I'm going to hand over to Farida for a final few words.
Thank you, Gav.
Thank you so much, Cormac. So I'm just going to share a few announcements with everyone. I'm sharing my screen. So as you know, this session is free, but we're currently running an appeal called the Drive for Digitalization. You've probably seen it around the news. So the Wanderlust team did a road trip from Ghana from Accra to London, and they're helping us connect 10,000 learners in communities in Ghana and in Kenya. So we are asking anyone here who is interested in supporting us to donate using the payment links that Fad will share in the chat. So Fad, please share the links in the chat. The links are in the chat. And thank you for donating as well. And then finally, you can subscribe to our newsletter if you want to hear more from us. I'm sure you want to hear more from us. Fad will also share the links to subscribe to our newsletter as well. And then we are on all social media platforms as Edu Sports, Instagram as edu_sports. And then the details are all here if you want to reach out to us or contact us regarding any particular matter that you want to discuss. So these are the details here. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. I think that marks the end of our Ignite talk for today. Thank you so much, Cormac, once again for joining. And I've just put into the chat Cormac Russell's Twitter feed as well. So if you have any further questions or ideas, I can see that Sarah has got her brain filling with ideas. So do feel free to share them with Cormac. I know he's on Twitter and on LinkedIn. So thank you once again, everybody, for joining.